guide up and ready to go for you, and you can work with that. It doesn't mean you can't start studying now. I mean, you most certainly can. And I would encourage you to get back in there, look at your notes. You're not going to be wasting any time or any effort looking at your notes without the study guide. Most of the stuff is interconnected inside of what we talk about, right? And so, you're going to be refreshing your memory on things. And, so it's a good thing, right? Go ahead and start looking at your notes as a study guide. And then you'll have the study guide here in the next probably 24, 48 hours. Okay. We'll talk more about the exam itself next week. We'll take a moment to carve out just a little bit of time to talk about it. Okay. So, questions on any of that? Get some thumbs up here. Looks like we're in
It's good. Place. No questions.
Okay. Rock and roll then. Okay. So, Tiara, go ahead, please.
Will we be going over the study guide in class afterwards?
I don't think we're going to have a chance to, which is not entirely a bad thing, because I think, my experience with in-class study sessions is that invariably somebody gets left out who has a question because there's only so much time. And I always feel like that's a bit unfair to somebody when that happens. So I don't think we'll have time anyway, just because of the way that the class is put together. So, but you guys will have it, a good, well over a week or, week and a half in advance. And so that's a really positive thing. Jacko, what's up?
This is not containing the midterm. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, perfectly fine.
Oh, okay. I just had to make sure. Okay.
Mm-hmm. All right, good enough. All right, so let's go ahead and let's get into the presentation. I'm realizing I didn't reset it after last class, so I got to get in here and reset it to the right spot so that you guys are, in the right place. Okay, good enough. And so what I really like is that I did schedule the class to be able to have 2 class sessions for this, which means we should be able to carve out enough space in the class and in, kind of in that's a lot of time to make sure we still get to do that online activity. Come on, you booger. I reset you. Don't do that to me. Okay. Sorry, I'm talking to the presentation. Anyhow, we should have time to do the online mini investigation and look into that and use that. And not only, I think, look into this unique slave rebellion, right? Which is really, we don't get to talk about a lot of those. It's a neat micro-historical opportunity. We're using the British Archive to make it happen. And so we'll have that, but we'll also get to talk about really that kind of question of representation of history on the internet, what we think of this kind of representation, or like how it compares to popular representations otherwise, and so forth and so on, right? I think that, we have an opportunity here to kind of really think about the way history is deployed into the general public. But we'll have time to take care of all of that. So, Will, what are you thinking? What's up?
Where do you find this presentation at on the course page?
Yes, all the presentations will be there. They should be, for the most part, they're titled. The folder is titled the same thing as the presentation, but every once in a while I didn't align them that way. But you can always still look in the syllabus, see what it's labeled as, and go and find it on D2L, and they're available. Or are you talking about the one that's recorded already?
The one that we're doing today in class.
One that we're doing. Yeah. All of the stuff is on D2L, but yeah, again, check with the syllabus and you'll see exactly where things are located, or should be able to see that. So again, what I'll tell you is, I cannot do an exhaustive coverage of the Atlantic slave trade. There has been so much written about it, and there's tons of really good scholarship out there on it. If it's a topic that interests you and you want to do more research on it, by all means, go and wade into this scholarship, right, and navigate your way around it. I can't promise that every piece of scholarship is the highest quality, but that's true in every field. But there is a lot of really good scholarship out there, and much more than I can effectively cover in 2 75-minute sessions. So, but it is obviously very important to talk about the topic of the Atlantic of reasons, right? For the obvious reason that it's impactful in terms of the development of portions of the Western world. It's impactful in terms of the cultural developments in the Western world, and you could argue even in West Africa, and in Europe. And so, there's a lot of reasons to talk about it, and probably I should say, also not at the not the least reason why. Again, another major reason to talk about it is that there are very few institutions in the history of the modern world that see the degree of humans involved, and I think you could argue impact as a result of that, right? In the end, we are talking about 12 or 13 million people, and I'll explain to you why. We've got a pretty good range here, and the numbers are starting to build and solidify both, and I'll explain that here in just a little bit. But we're talking about a good 12, 13 million people over the course of 400 years. That's a huge number of people impacted. I think it's the same kind of mentality we have to have about things like the Holocaust, right? Also, this idea of how many millions of people are we talking about who are directly impacted, and there's larger impact of that too. And I don't think anybody would argue that we, anything but that we have to cover the Holocaust, right? It's an important event to talk about. Historians, I think, would make the argument that these kinds of events are important to talk about because, one, we don't want to see, in the case of Holocaust, we don't see genocide repeated. In the case of the Atlantic slave trade, we don't want to see slavery repeated. And I think most historians are aware that the reality is that human trafficking is just slavery, and it is going on still. And I think that's something that a lot of historians are always hesitant to say, hey, let's use our history to change present situations. But I think this is one of those cases, especially where historians are willing to say, hey, if we can study the past and understand how past institutions of enslavement worked, perhaps we can learn something about how to break down the systems that exist now, right? Why do certain people get involved? Can we give them exit ramps out of the institution, because the institution can't exist if it doesn't have people carrying it out, right? So, there's always that possibility. So I think it's important for a number of reasons. Now, again, I tell you, there's only so many things I can do in the amount of time allotted to me. And so these are some of the focuses that we're going to have. And this is just generally speaking. We are going to take a look at many different forms of slavery existing both prior to and at the same time as the Atlantic slave trade. All right. It will not shock anybody. Anybody who's ever studied the ancient world knows that slavery is not a new institution. However, and it may also shock people that every institution of slavery operates differently. So we are going to study them, right? Especially those that run at the same time as the Atlantic slave trade, to understand what's different about them. I mean, what's the same about them is that they're slavery, and that's not okay regardless. But we are going to study what's different about them. And then we'll also talk about how these different forms of enslavement kind of we get into the 18th century, that the African slave trade, which was in West Africa before Europeans got there, starts to show hallmarks or traits of the Atlantic trade. And maybe not surprising because they have interacted with each other, right? So we're also going to talk about as many people as we possibly can. We'll start to consider, larger and larger portions of those involved in the Atlantic slave trade, both those that make it possible and those who resist it. And, this means not only talking about European kings and merchants and those who own plantations or commercial ventures that use enslaved labor. That's been the traditional focus. But in the last 20 years, opened up to say, well, on the ground level in West Africa, there are people carrying it out there. Who are they and why are they involved? And so we're really starting to paint the larger picture now. And ask those interesting questions about why certain people would get involved. And I think some of these answers will be, I think you'll find them rather intriguing. So we're then going to move on to a debate that has existed in the field, and it's kind of a weird debate in some ways. I think my generation of scholars look at it and we kind of throw our hands up in the air and just shake our heads about the previous generations of historians who couldn't listen to each other well and were very rigid in their opinions. One of which was the oldest camp of thought was that the Atlantic slave trade was a purely financial and commercial institution. There was a generation after them that said, no, this institution was largely predicated upon interpretations of race. And my generation came along and said, you guys do realize there's something of both, right? Which 9 times out of 10, by the way, y'all, is the answer. When person A and person B start arguing, usually person C needs to come along and figure out what to take from each of them to come up with the best answer. And so that's what my generation has done. And we'll talk about that and kind of talk about how we've settled into what I think is a more complete and more inclusive perspective on the big picture about the Atlantic slave trade, because it is a very unique trade in many ways, including the fact that it did focus in exclusively on one racial group, right? Not something we see in the vast majority of slave institutions throughout history. So then we probably won't get to it today, which is fine. We'll probably make this hopefully the sole thing that we have to talk about before we work with our website next Tuesday, and that is talk about the impacts of slavery, both on Africa and the Western world, which I'm probably going to bump out just a little bit. I'm going to expand it just a little bit to cover some of the elements of the Columbian Exchange, right? Because we didn't get to talk about it. I will then try to talk a little bit about cultural exchange, right? And maybe even take a moment to talk about these questions of kind of epidemiology that show up. We'll bring those up today, but then I'll revisit them to give a little bit better detail then. So let's dive on in and talk about some of the precursors, both in terms of slavery in Africa, slavery amongst native societies in the Americas, and even native societies in the near Atlantic. And then we'll move on to talking about precursors to the Atlantic slave trade in the New World, right? Other than just the enslavement of native groups. Again, as I told you, slavery is not a new institution. We can go back and look at the Romans, we can look at the Greeks, right? We can, there's a lot of ancient societies we can see this in. And so it's not a new institution, but so it's important to note that it's there already. And it's there already when Europeans show up in Africa looking for slave labor. They've been practicing, slavery in Europe prior to this. But what we're going to see is that, it's there, but maybe it's different, right? And not maybe, it is different. Let's just put it that way. So some of the earliest forms of the slave trade that we could talk about, right, beginning in, somewhere around 700 Common Era, we know that on the East Coast and the southeastern portion of Africa, and this is something we talked about at the very beginning of the semester, we know that there was a slave trade that went into the Arabian Peninsula. We refer to that as the Arab slave trade. Sometimes that trade went as far as sending enslaved East African, enslaved Southern African peoples as far as. All right, so we have this rather distant trade network that happened. I think more important to our purposes is to talk about the African slave trade, which was in West Africa before the Europeans got there. Now, understand this, it is a completely different institution than the Atlantic slave trade, all right? What do they have in common? Let's start there. They're both institutions of enslavement. And again, I don't think I can say it too many times. It doesn't matter if they're different the way they're practiced, they're still enslavement. That's not okay, regardless, okay? But we do have to study the differences. The African slave trade was really, truly an institution of redemption, rehabilitation, right? Punishment, you could say, but for the sake of redemption, okay? And in that way, what I'm sounding like is the theory of the way prisons are supposed to work, right? We're not going to open up that can of worms here in the Western world. And the idea is this: in the African slave trade, the people who were enslaved were prisoners of war, debtors who owed a debt to somebody but couldn't pay it back, and criminals. Now, in all three cases, you're talking about people who owe a debt to society. Prisoners of war, of course, owe a debt to the society they attacked, right, to compensate for damage they may have done, the loss they may have caused. Debtors who owe somebody in society an amount could work off that debt, right, through their enslavement. They owe that debt to society. And criminals, too, have done some kind of damage to society. And all three of these, we could say the same thing, can be put into some kind of a punishment of enslavement by which they can redeem themselves, pay off their debt, and do understand, be set free after they've paid off their debt. Now, if all of those things that I said sound like I'm saying the humanity of the enslaved is never forgotten, then you've picked up on the right message. Because it's true. The big difference between the African slave trade and the Atlantic slave trade is that the African trade never denies the humanity of the people involved. All right, I'm not going to say it doesn't have some harsh elements to it. We know of plantations in the Sudan or gold mines in the Gold Coast that were incredibly dangerous, that cost people's lives because they were so harsh, right? But the institution itself of the African trade sees that these are people who owe a debt. They need to pay back their debt. They'll do it through a term of enslavement, which is handed to them by a judicial system. They go, they live with the family, right? They serve out their debt. And while they are living with that family, they're made part of the family, right? They dine with the family. If they are, not as old as the parents, but older than the children, they receive food at the table before the children receive the food. All right, they're treated with humanity. They're never denied that. And in fact, even when they're finally manumitted or set free out of their term, there's many examples of them melding with the communities where they were enslaved. Now, let's be clear about this. There's a big debate. Historical sociologists have argued for some time that, there's two camps. One says, well, these guys never erased the stigma of having been enslaved as punishment. But people who became the mayors of those towns where they had been enslaved, still out there. People are still arguing about it. But I'm kind of with the second camp. It seems to me that at least some portion of these people must have been folded into society and accepted, right? But again, you can't have that if you don't have an understanding of their humanity and a belief in their humanity, right? Which leads to these better forms of treatment and eventually them being melded into the community. Now, again, I say all that. It is not at all overkill to say, again, it's a form of slavery. So we have to be really thoughtful about what we say here. We can't just say, oh, it was easier or it was, no. Because partially it's not true. There were parts of it that were really bad. But on top of that, I mean, come on, we don't really know what it was like exactly. We weren't, we weren't part of it. But what the scholarship says, what the research says is, okay, this is not the Atlantic trade. The Atlantic trade saw people as property. And the term, most specifically, and I'll give you the term, is chattel, ChatTtel. Again, that's ChatTtel. That is the term in the Atlantic trade for enslaved people. They are seen as, and chattel means, legally speaking, movable, disposable property. All right, by which I mean, and when I use disposable, I mean can be sold, right? Can be gotten rid of. There were law codes in place about excessive abuse of slaves and killing of slaves in some places, not everywhere, but in some places. But the thought in the end was this is not a human, this is property. We'll come back to that as we get further into the presentation, because there's something, the Atlantic slave trade is a bit of a paradox, honestly. All right, and we'll talk about that. So there is slavery in Europe, as we said before. You should know, right? You know that Europeans had been practicing slavery clear back into the ancient world, but even in our own time period, the time period we're studying here, right? We see that as territories that were run by Muslims, like in the Iberian Peninsula, that as they were conquered, there were Muslims that were turned into servants or turned into slaves. There was the purchase, we've come to find out, of some North African, enslaved peoples into Europe. Europeans, of course, had really been accessing labor markets in Eastern Europe also for enslaved labor. That'll come up again later on. And then we even see that Europeans initially, in the early portions of the early modern period, did practice native enslavement. The native group on the Canary Islands was a group called the Guanches. They were enslaved and forced to work on sugar plantations on the Canary Islands. And Columbus actually returned from his second voyage with hundreds of native slaves. And quite honestly, he almost didn't get a third voyage because of it, because Isabel was very angry. Her statement to him was, I view natives as my subjects, right? They're on my lands in the New World, and I view them as my subjects, as my children, just as I view the people of Spain as my subjects and my children. And she was very, very mad at him. And in fact, she and Ferdinand put together a series of laws that, and she made sure that the laws said that natives were not to be enslaved unless, and there's one caveat, we talked about this before, unless they were cannibals. Right? You might recall we talked about the possibility that Diego Duran included cannibalism in his account of the Aztecs to legitimate using force against them, right? So we do see all of that, but of course, then we get into the situation where when we talk about native enslavement in the Americas, now by the time we get into about the year 1505, Spain has these new laws about not enslaving natives. Does it still happen? Well, there are labor systems developed in Central and South America by Spain, which for all intents and purposes are just legalized slavery. And the Spanish don't have great success monitoring all their lands because they're, at least 3 or 4 weeks boat ride away from getting to the Americas. So it's hard to police this stuff. Plus, the Portuguese have really vague laws about enslavement, and Spanish slave traders will operate in Portuguese territories instead, right? Or capture natives in Spanish territories and sell them in Portuguese territories. So, it's not as cut and dry as you might think when you get down to it. Oh, come on now. There you go, computer. So let's go up to North America and talk about another expression of enslavement that really actually is a precursor to the kind of massive use of enslaved African labor in the British North American colonies and the French colonies in what is now Canada. This group of laborers we refer to as indentured servants. Indentured servants, right, again, either served in British North America, or you can find them, as I said, in New France also. What these guys did was, these guys who were mostly Northern Europeans would sign a contract. The contract would be a contract for a period of labor in the New World, and in return, they would get their way paid to the New World, which was expensive, right? So this was kind of I don't have any options at home in Europe. I'm going to sign one of these contracts. I'm going to go to the New World. I'll labor for, if you're in British North America, a period between 4 and 7 years, whatever is negotiated in the contract. And you can literally see one of the contracts here off to the side. And then when that time period's over, I'm free to go ahead and start my life in the Americas. In New France, you can tell that they were having trouble getting people to New France. The period was only 3 years compared to British North America. New France always had a population issue, right? It was hard to get the French to New France. In fact, its population growth stayed pretty consistently at like 0. There were just enough migration and just enough childbirth to cancel out the number of deaths that happened on any given year, right? It stayed pretty close to 0 the entire time that New France was in existence. However, I will say this, there's a boom in terms of population in the Virginia colony, for example, in the 1620s. Part of it is, that free land is being given away, right? But what ends up happening is people come over and then tobacco has been introduced and they want to grow tobacco and make money in this commercial colony. And this, desire to grow tobacco prompts them to think about the labor force they need, and they start purchasing the contracts of indentured servants. So most of the population boom of the 1620s and most of the labor in the 1620s is a result of indentured servant migration, okay, at least in Virginia. Now, I have to tell you that over the course of the 1600s, some attitudes change and some financial circumstances change that cause indentured servitude to decline and disappear. All right. One is that these people who held the contracts did some really sketchy things to try to extend contracts out or to make claims about, oh, well, but that year is invalid because you did this or that, or you were sick for a period of time and that needs to add more time on, or you name it, right? They would try to find any way they could to finagle more time out of the contract. Oftentimes, if they couldn't finagle more time out of the contract, they would just work those indentured servants as hard as they possibly could, to, get the most out of the contract, which meant then that, these people were being put through incredibly harsh situations, and their lives put in danger. And that really shook up a lot of Europeans, right? They were really kind of concerned. Many deemed it quote unquote white slavery, and were concerned that if this is the way that Europeans were going to treat each other in this contractual situation, what was to stop Europeans from starting to just enslave each other, and making it a lifelong obligation? Now, I have to tell you that during this time period in the 1600s, there was enslaved African labor also, but the access to the enslaved African labor, the numbers, right? It was just, the access was not good to enslaved African laborers. And so the cost of purchasing enslaved African labor was really pretty high. It was, for these guys, in these guys' minds, it was cheaper to purchase these contracts for indentured servants instead. But that all changed in the 1690s. During the 1600s, there had been one British company that was allowed to be involved in the Atlantic slave trade. It was a group called the Royal African Company. And in 1698, the British government took that monopoly away from that company and opened up the slave trade to everyone. And as you can imagine, the numbers went crazy. So as we approach the end of the 1600s and more people get involved, the number of enslaved Africans introduced into the labor market grows, which means the cost of purchasing enslaved African labor goes down, and that shifts the tide also. So in addition to Europeans starting to question the treatment of indentured servants, they also then see that African labor is becoming cheaper to purchase. It may be more expensive up front, but instead of having to get more contracts and more contracts, you, in theory, by law, own that slave for life. Okay? So that's going to bring about the shift toward what we think of normally when we think of the institution of, Atlantic slavery and the practice of using enslaved African labor. So I want to talk about the European involvement first, maybe from a slightly different standpoint, right? We're going to read documents that have European traders in them. I think we're all very familiar with the involvement of European slave traders, the involvement of European and American slave owners, the use of slave labor on any number of commercial or agricultural environments in the Americas, and maybe less so in Europe, but that was a thing also. I want to talk about essentially the involvement of the states in general in the slave trade, and kind of give us an idea of who the major slave trading powers were. And I have to tell you that when we talk about the 1500s, the closest thing we can say to anybody who was kind of leading or dominating in the slave trade was probably the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, were, I think you could say, more or less the biggest slave trading power throughout most of the 1500s, but definitely by the end of the 1500s, they became the largest slave trading power. And there's a very good reason for that, right? The reason why that's the timetable and how it develops that way is because toward the last quarter of the 16th century, the Portuguese monarchy had no heir, and a war broke out between the different households that could all claim the throne. Well, one of those households just happened to be the Spanish monarchy. And the Spanish monarchy ended up fighting in this war and beating the other groups and taking over Portugal and its colonies also. That was in 1580 when we see the union of crowns between those two groups, all right, between the Spanish and the Portuguese, at which time the Spanish, who were never that much of a slave trading power, right? They did have slaves in their colonies, but more often than not, they seemed to purchase them from other kingdoms, right? Other people who were trading. Spain did that very much here. They put the actual purchase and trading of enslaved African labor in the hands of the Portuguese, because they now were all part of the same, the same empire. All right. So Portugal became the leader. And that was until about the mid 1600s when the Portuguese got beat out by the Dutch. The Dutch, you have to understand, did have an empire in the 1600s, but the Dutch it's kind of a weird empire. It's not the traditional empire you think of, like, all of this land, right, conquered by military. No, the Dutch were much more of a business empire. The Dutch were known for making really inexpensive ships by which they could ship cargo around the world. And the Dutch turned this into shipping for any number of things and became a great imperial power. Thus, it wasn't really hard for them to get involved in the slave trade also, because they were already sailing back and forth across the Atlantic on a regular basis and were such a shipping magnate, such a shipping power, that they got involved in the slave trading business. And one of the things that really drove them to do so was they did, through military action, take over a Portuguese/Spanish city, a city called Pernambuco. Pernambuco was fabulously wealthy because of the sugar industry, which meant that the Dutch got very interested in growing sugar, and thus they needed the labor force to support the sugar industry, and they got involved in the Atlantic slave trade. And in fact, came to dominate it for a period of time, until that demonopolization I mentioned to you that happens in 1698, when the British government makes it possible for all merchants to get involved. And you're going to see the numbers here in just a little bit. The British, it just spreads like wildfire throughout their commercial sector. Merchants come out of the woodwork and just start getting involved in the Atlantic slave trade. All right. So, and we'll see the numbers and you'll see what I mean. It's literally a 500% increase as a result of that demonopolization. So, as I said to you, we've talked forever about European involvement, European traders, European kings, kingdoms, European landholders in the Americas. It's only been in the last 20 years that I think rather intelligent and wise scholars have said, well, that's part of the equation. But this institution was alive for 400 years, and it could not have happened without the kind of cogs in the machine that happened on the ground level in Africa too. And in fact, one of those guys that drew attention to it is a guy, he was at Emory. I don't know if he still is or not. His name is David Eltis. And he said, honestly, Europeans, most specifically the Portuguese, kind of co-opted African institutions. They showed up in Africa, and trust me, he says, the Portuguese would have been glad to have been able to militarily take over African societies and have unlimited access to slave labor. The Europeans were looking for a labor force, right? I told you before, they had been using Eastern European labor forces, right? This is where the term slave comes from Slavic or Slav, right? However, those labor sources were being blocked off by the Ottoman Empire. So these guys Europeans came into West Africa thinking about finding labor sources, right? Finding sources of enslaved labor. And Eltis's argument is the problem was, for the Portuguese, was that, of course, they couldn't take over. The Portuguese weren't strong enough to beat these African societies. So they settled for the second best thing, which was these African societies oftentimes had practices of enslavement already that then the Portuguese could tap into. So, in the end, he says, really, this institution, the Atlantic slave trade, could not have taken place without degrees of involvement from African society, in which case we talk about those who kind of bring the enslaved together to transition them from the African trade into the Atlantic trade. That includes African traders that do this. That includes transporters that do this. It includes translators that do this. But in addition to that, we also are talking about kings who essentially, strike up these deals, right? Strike up these connections with European slave traders and facilitate this transition of people out of the African trade into the Atlantic trade. Now, the motivations become a real big question, right? Like, what motivates one to do any of these kinds of things? I think we'll talk about some of those motivations when we look at some of the documentation that we're going to study, for our discussion next Thursday. However, I do want to take a moment and look at one case study here and assure you, or just kind of explore some of these motivations. So the group we're going to talk about is actually just to the north of there's the southern coast of the Bulge of Africa here. And if you go inland from where it says Slave Coast right here, where my pointer is, and you come inland just a little bit, you'll see kind of small here, it says Dahomey. All right. So we're going to talk about the Dahomeans, who were involved in the slave trade in the 18th century. Now, before we get involved with this and start talking about their trades with the British in the 18th century, let's kind of take a look at the background of the Dahomeans. These guys remind me just a little bit of the Aztecs, in that the Aztecs were a warring society. They made most of their bread and butter, right? Like most of their life existence and livelihood was based on their military action. And that's true of the Dahomeans too. The one big difference is Dahomey actually had female regiments also that fought. But the Dahomeans would go and they would conquer and they would capture people. They would take tribute, but they would capture people and they would introduce them into their society as slaves. And along would come the British in the 18th century. They would encounter the Dahomeans and they would say, how do you feel about selling us some of your prisoners of war? We would like to purchase them as enslaved members or as enslaved people and introduce them into like British territories. And the Dahomeans say, well, what's in it for us? And they say, well, we can give you money, right? Or we can give you whatever kinds of trade goods you might want. And they do get these kinds of things. But the big thing is they offer the Dahomeans guns. Well, Dahomey is a military society, and they're always looking for an advantage over their neighbors. So when the British say, we'll give you guns, that's a big deal because that gives them an advantage. So Dahomey actually actively engages in this trade into the Atlantic slave trade as a strategy. One, we trade, we get guns. All right. When our guns break, we run out of ammunition, we trade and we get replacement guns, or we get more ammunition or whatever it is. And you might say this creates a bit of a dependency cycle, and it does. because the British are not giving them the best quality guns. They're giving them stuff that are 2 and 3 generations old. All right, but still trading with them and giving them these things and giving them an advantage over their neighbors then. But in addition to that, as Dahomey sells prisoners of war to the British, they're also selling off neighboring enemies who are going to be taken away from the continent, which is going to weaken their enemies. So it's all part of a strategy. Now, I have had students then say to me in the past, well, how could one African king sell other Africans off into slavery? And I think that we have to do is we have to stop and say, in this time period, that sense of Pan-Africanism that you're talking about there, right, of seeing we're all part of Africa, that's not really in existence in this time period. All right. In fact, right, that's really much more modern that there's been any sense of that. And even then, when I say that, invariably, I have 2 or 3 African students in class that say, well, you know, there's still divisions in Africa, not just between rival countries, but like, you know, East Africa is a very different place from like Saharan and Northern Africa. And, you know, Central Africa is a pretty different place, even from South Africa. So like, there's a sense that we're all part of the same continent, but in many ways, our histories are very different, right? And our regions are very different. And in that particular way, there may not be as much Pan-African connection as one might imagine, right? Well, in this time period, there's really none to speak of, right? The Dahomeans would have seen themselves as Dahomean, right? And the Ashanti would have seen themselves as Ashanti, and the people of Ouidah would have seen themselves as Ouidah, right? And there would have been clashes. And there might have been generations of bad blood between them, tension between them. So in that way, then what Dahomey is doing is they're not selling off other Africans, they're selling off enemies and rivals. So this was part of strategy for them. All right. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't say, okay, we're talking about the question of the involvement in making the slave trade possible. What if we also talk about involvement in trying to resist it? Because resistance is still important to study. So, forgive me for just 1 second. I'm look at the clock. Okay, we're doing all right on time. The history of the Atlantic slave trade is not without its study of mutinies and rebellions, insurrections, and we are going to study Busa's rebellion, you know, not too far, you know, next Tuesday, right? And we'll see what that is all about. And it's important to study these because these are, you know, these are historical events, right? And they do have some impact, right, when you get down to it. But I think for me, you know, we can study, for example, talk about the Senegambia, which appears there on the west coast of this map, which was a region that was known for its resistance to European slave traders. In fact, they quite often met European boats with violence and hostility to drive them away, right? And that is an active form of resistance. But there are other forms of resistance that I think are really powerful and really impressive, and I want to offer you one of them. When the Portuguese went to Brazil, they, of course, brought Catholicism with them, and they wanted to practice their Catholicism there. And then they, of course, created fazendas, right? Plantations, and they used enslaved African labor on them, and they wanted to introduce the enslaved people on their lands. They wanted to introduce them to Catholicism, right? And potentially convert them over to Catholicism. And so, you know, the churches, of course, got established in Brazil, not to the same degree we see in Spanish America, but still. And inside the cities and the towns, there were organizations affiliated with the church. And in particular, one of those organizations was called a confraternity, cofradia, right, is what they were called, but confraternity. Confraternities are like, how do I put this? Like the Lions Club, but religiously affiliated. So they do good works for the public, and they do charity and philanthropy and things like that, but they are connected to the church, and they always have a saint that is like the patron saint of their confraternity, and that they celebrate. They try to honor that saint on the Saint's Day and so forth, right? Well, those confraternities developed amongst the Brazilians that were in the New World. And as they wanted to introduce the enslaved members of society to Catholicism, they encouraged them to convert. And when they did, they encouraged them to start confraternities of their own. So there became what were known as Black confraternities. Okay. And these confraternities then had to, of course, choose patron saints that they would, honor. And the study that was done, and I thought this was really interesting, right, and very powerful. The men's confraternities quite often chose saints that were warriors. Now, quite often these warrior saints were Coptic Christian, which means they came from East African Christianity, right? They had been introduced to them, they had been, made aware of them, and they selected these guys, one, to connect themselves to Africa in some way, as this was their homeland originally, right? As this was a place that they wanted to keep in their mind and think about not only their heritage, but the people that they knew that they had been forced to leave behind, right? But also chose warriors because I think in many ways it kind of gave them this little bit of hope of this thought of someday we will rise up against this institution of slavery and we will be rid of it. The way the women's confraternities operated, I found just as powerful, if not, really incredibly just wow. That's all I could say is wow, right? These women's confraternities formed, they chose their saints, and quite often they chose, again, African female saints, Coptic Christian saints, but they chose virgin saints, by which I don't mean like the Virgin Mary, right, who is, of course, known for giving birth despite being a virgin, right, to Jesus. She gives birth to Jesus. These were virgin saints that maintained celibacy for their entire lives. And the scholar was really interesting. What the scholar had to say about this was that this was a form of resistance, that these women chose these virgin saints because they inspired these women and remind these women to remain celibate and not get pregnant, because the law held that the female slave was the property of the master, therefore her body was the property of the master, and if she became pregnant, the child, which was of her body, became property of the master. And therefore, in finding inspiration in these virgin saints, she was able to find a form of resistance, which was to say, I too will remain celibate. I will never get pregnant because I will never give a master one of my children. And it's heartbreaking to think how many of these women may have wanted families, but it's completely awe-inspiring to think that strength to say, my form of resistance is, I will not do this because I will not give you my child. I mean, it's wow. It's just wow. That's all you can say. How powerful. So I want to move on to the debate that I alluded to earlier, which is this question of both the commercial and the question of race inside of the institution of slavery. And as I told you before, right, the Europeans, I think you could say it was in their mind, they wanted a labor force, and that labor force was intended to make possible the financial and commercial goals that they had. And of course, they lost access to those Eastern European labor forces. So when they set out into the age of exploration, they did set out thinking about where might we find in some labor force, right? Possibly enslaved labor force to be able to use back in Europe, right? Or as it would turn out, also in European colonies in the Americas. Now, I think it's really undeniable. I think even when my generation says, okay, there's more to this picture, my generation of scholars says, well, there's clearly a commercial motivation. And we'll read documents that show the commercial side of the institution. However, it is also undeniable about the Atlantic slave trade that it did focus in on one racial group. And we can see that really kind of concentrated, it really kind of built and developed and centralized for a variety of different reasons. All right, so some of those reasons were, again, financial, but fed into a focus. So for example, when the first few generations of natives were living under colonial rule in the Americas, they were still very subject to diseases that they had not been exposed to. It turns out, though, most West Africans had come in contact with diseases from Europe and Asia. So they, in most cases, had immunities to these diseases. But as a result of the fact that Native Americans did not have the immunities, and that there were laws that said Native Americans can't be enslaved, what ended up happening was there became rumors that, it was a better investment to go ahead and look toward West African laborers because they weren't, quote unquote, fragile like natives, right? Which, of course, it wasn't that the natives were really fragile. It was that they were still susceptible to these diseases, right? Which they would develop immunities to eventually. It took a little time for natives to develop some immunities because they were oftentimes being put into work allotments where they were working 18 hours a day. It doesn't matter if you have one generation of immunities to diseases. If you're working 18 hours of hard labor a day, your body is breaking down and your immune system is weakened by that kind of, excessive labor, which means you're still vulnerable. All right. But in the end, there became the focus in on African labor because they didn't seem to, be as vulnerable to these diseases, right? There was always concerns that natives, if enslaved or put into a work allotment, knew the lay of the land and could run away, right? And of course, the funny thing about that is that Europeans never estimated that Native Americans would share with enslaved Africans how to get away and what the lay of the land was. But it does happen quite a bit, actually. Anyhow, in addition to that, there were a number of products in the Americas that required skills that were common to West African societies. One of the great examples being, and I have a bill of advertisement later on in the presentation that is an advertisement of an auction in Charleston, South Carolina, for slaves coming from the quote unquote rice coast. This is a portion of West Africa where rice was grown. It had been introduced in from Asia into Africa through traders, and rice was grown there rather successfully. Well, if you know anything about South Carolinian colonial history, rice is a major, major product. And so South Carolinian rice plantation owners really wanted to purchase enslaved Africans from the rice coast because they didn't have to train them for those job skills. These were skills that they already had. They knew how to do these things. And so that also concentrated the focus on West African societies, that there were particular skills that we're talking about there. And then, of course, all of this got reinforced by the fact that as West African institutions of slavery got co-opted by Europeans, and during the 1700s, numbers of West Africans purchased from, African kingdoms or African traders or whatever it might be, and then brought over. It made the price of purchasing enslaved African labor drop, which reinforces. So all of this forces this kind of focus, even if it's financially, it forces a focus on West Africa. Now, with all that said, the longer an institution stays focused on one particular group, one particular racial group, one particular social group, one particular anything, it stands to reason that eventually that's going to get woven into the fabric of the institution, where that people who are targeted will be seen as inherently worthy of slavery. And so we're going to see that, for example, some of these merchants will offer language that justifies enslaving West Africans because they're Black Africans, right? And so the institution is not without its racialized component, because there may be that opportunity that in the minds of merchants, that situation in which they can justify what they're doing by othering the West African. This person is not like us. This person doesn't live like us. They're quote unquote inferior to us, whatever it may be. Othering is what they call it in sociology, when you define a group that's outside of the empowered group and you try to justify your own power, your own belonging, your own actions through pointing to the difference and otherness of others. Okay? And so that does become part of the institution. And I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that some people in the Atlantic slave trade, you know, if I have to say, some of them did, and I've not seen it incredibly widespread, right? It probably is bigger than I've seen, right? But I think there's a rather big scale here. There are some who developed hatred out of that, right? You know, William Snellgrave is one of these guys who writes a handbook that's a handbook on how to prevent mutinies on slave ships. And when you read his language, you can tell this guy justifies being a slaver because he's developed a dislike for the people he enslaves, right? And certainly takes this tone. Now, I will tell you, again, I think there's a rather broad spectrum. I think there are people who were very incredibly mechanically commercial. I think there were probably people, right, who were the opposite end of the spectrum who focused very much on race instead. And I think probably the reality is there's some mixture in between that is probably the predominance of the people who got involved in the Atlantic slave trade. All right. That's how history usually works, is it's usually a pretty big mix. And I think, again, that's where I think it's intelligent the way my generation of scholars have said, it is undeniable that there's a financial basis here, but it is also undeniable that it focused so exclusively on one group that there became an obvious association between that particular group and the concept of quote unquote justified enslavement in the minds of those who were involved in the institution. Right? It's a mixture, and that just makes sense. So, anybody have, before I move on, because I know that is a, you know, this is a topic that it's been hard for historians to work with, right? And I know that it has been moderately contentious. I'm curious if anybody has any questions about that before we move on. Okay, right on. So let's talk now about transportation. And the reason why I want to do that is because I want to talk, we can talk about numbers as a result of that, but we can also talk about kind of unseen elements of the institution of slavery. You know, or in particular, the Atlantic slave trade. One of those things being the inland transportation. We know that some portion of enslaved Africans who were sold into the Atlantic slave trade were brought from inland regions and brought out to the coastline. More often than not, they were put into transportation groups like what you see here, right? Which is what we would call a coffle. All right, C-O-F-F-L-E, coffle. All right, and quite honestly, I mean, you know, the coffle was just the way by which slave traders land transported enslaved Africans out to the coastline to be sold into the Atlantic slave trade. I mean, that's the definition, right? But part of the reason why I talk about this is because there are a few things that we need to think about. One of which is a lot of these coffles don't have great records. So in that, we originally worked kind of with the thought that there were 11 million enslaved Africans in the trade. Then our numbers started growing and we got to 12 million. And then even recently, I've seen scholarship that says we may be talking between 13 and 13.5 million. I honestly am not certain. We can't say that the number is bigger than that because we don't know how many people were lost in these coffles. Just that simple. So the numbers are, it stands to reason, are probably even larger than that. Now, I have to say, before we ever forget to mention it, we do have actually fairly decent numbers as a basis to work from, not like certain other things we've talked about where we've been like, we don't have good numbers of that. In the 1990s, the Church of Latter-day Saints did a project where they pulled ship manifests and cargo manifests and documents otherwise that could try to not only get accurate numbers of enslaved Africans transported to the Americas, but also shipped, taken to other places. It also tried really hard to get their specific names as they were named in the Americas, but also, if they could, specific names as they were named in Africa. So this is it was a massive effort, and it's a ginormous database. But they did such good work, and the history community is grateful for them putting the resources toward it, salvaging people's names and, keeping them from disappearing into the dustbin of history, but also giving us a better idea, right? Now, the other thing I want to talk about with coffles is this is where we get to this question of paradox. All right, the Atlantic slave trade to me has always struck me as a bit of a paradox in the following way. The Atlantic slave trade justifies itself legally by denying the humanity of those enslaved. They are property, they are not people, according to the Atlantic slave trade. And when you ask people, well, how did they miss the humanity, right? How did people cope with this and not see the humanity of the people they were enslaving? You'll hear people say things like, oh, well, they looked at them like livestock, not as humans. Well, I have to beg to differ that it's not that simple. When you look at the Atlantic slave trade, you find there are far too many connections to the humanity of the enslaved for slave traders to have not been regularly aware of it. Here's what I mean. If you look at that coffle and the way that people are being transported, they are chained at the neck or yoked at the neck. And the reason why the neck is because, let's face it, it's probably the most vulnerable part of the human body. If you push on the front, you can constrict airway. If you hit at the base of the neck on the back, you can knock people unconscious. You can disorient them. You can actually even cause them paralysis or death. So the way by which these coffle drivers or coffle conductors, whatever you want to call them, were able to control slaves that were in an institution where they were not seen as human, the way they were controlled was by acknowledging how human bodies work. Right? The same thing can be said about thinking about how much food or water does a slave need to stay alive on a slave ship during the Middle Passage to the Americas. You're not asking how much food and water does livestock need. You're asking about how much food and water does a human need. When you take them to auction and you sell them, you are not measuring their worth by can they pull a plow like a horse. You're measuring their ability as a human to execute work. There's far too many indicators of humanity here, right, for us to say that the institution purely saw property. So it's a bit of a paradox when you get down to it. And I think we're going to see that in some of our documents too, that some of our authors of these documents can't help but accidentally acknowledge the humanity of the people they're enslaving. All right? Here's the Middle Passage. I'm offering it to you. I mean, you're very familiar with the images, right? You know, these ships were packed with humans, with an understanding in most captains' minds they would lose between 10 and 12% of the people on this ship. They insured usually their ships somewhere to lose 15 to 20%, and they just estimated they would lose 10 or 12%. Okay, and it's, yeah, I mean, that's just mind-blowing when you get down to it. But with that said, here are your numbers. In that very first century, between 1519, which is roughly where we place the first shipment of enslaved labor to the Americas, we see 250,000. That's not a small number. But once the Dutch get hold of the trade and start, infusing the sugar industry in the Americas with native I'm not sorry, not native. With African labor, we see it go up to 1.2 million. But remember, I told you the British will in 1698 demonopolize the trade, and it goes up by 500% to 6 million over that 100 years. All right. So this one, as I told you, this total only comes up to 11 million. The more recent numbers that I've seen, we're pushing over 12. And then I just literally 3 days ago, maybe heard a scholar talking about between 13 and 13.5, right? So I had to have to look into how that person's calculating. But suffice it to say, I mean, we are talking about massive quantities of people. Now, I'm about to free you from information here. Triangle trade, we do not need to learn it. Even if you learned it in the past, I'm going to tell you, I don't use it in my class. I used to, but I'm actually actively keep it here on this slide so I can dump it, right? I can break up with it because scholarship has shown so many complexities that get left out with the triangle trade that I don't use it anymore. I don't think it's a neat and tidy historical model. I think it's neglectful. So I leave it out. I want to focus in on this map instead. And the reason why is because this map tells us, I mean, something really rather interesting. I think when we look at this map and we look at North America, we expect to see bigger numbers than what we see there, right? We talk about American plantation life or American commercial life, and we talk about the use of significant quantities of enslaved African labor. And then we see between 1650 and 1860, that number is 500,000, which is still a large number of people. But you look over there and you see Europe in that same time period is 0.3 million. It's almost the same amount, which is weird to us because we never talk about Europe using enslaved African labor during this time period. They did, I assure you. But it's weird to us that the numbers would be almost the same. So as you look around at these different numbers and you see different places, you come to very quickly notice that there are two places that are very, very heavily responsible for these numbers being as high as they are. The Caribbean, called the West Indies here, 4.5 million. And Brazil at 5 million. Now, I can tell you there are a variety of crops in both of those places that would have drawn African labor, but there's one crop in particular, and it's sugar. Okay, so I put up here products that use enslaved African labor. I mentioned tobacco to you already. We talked about rice. Indigo is another one that was big in South Carolina in particular. But sugar is where I want to focus and what I want to talk about for the last 2 minutes of class. All right, and then we'll leave it at this. Sugar is from Indonesia originally, folks. And when Europeans first got their hands on sugar, hundreds of years before this, they loved sugar, but it was a luxury good because they had to import it from Indonesia. So they were always looking for some way that they could grow it and not have to have it as an expensive luxury good. When they discovered islands like the Canary Islands, Madeira, the Azores, the Cape Verde Islands, they decided they wanted to try to grow sugar there, and they did try. The sugar was okay. It was not great quality, but at least it wasn't going to be as expensive because they could get their hands on it easier. But then when they made it to the Caribbean, they realized they had the perfect conditions. By the time we get to the 18th century, Caribbean islands see a lot of sugar development, and sugar starts to get put into the European diet at greater amounts, and the demand skyrockets. So if the demand back home increases, then obviously plantation owners are going to try to grow more. They're going to make bigger plantations. They're going to put more slaves on them. 200 slaves was the average number on a Jamaican sugar plantation. All right, so it's big. That's part of the reason why sugar during especially the 18th century, but even the late 17th century, why the sugar industry causes the slave numbers to grow. But there's two other reasons, and here they are. One, sugar is incredibly time sensitive. Incredibly time sensitive. Rain comes down heavy in the Caribbean, then the sun comes out and it starts to dry it up. All right. cane grows because of this, but the cane, if it sits for too long, either because of the water or because of time, either way, it can rot. So you have to have people in the field, circling around in the field, looking for cane to cut all the time. All right, they'll do this by hand with a machete during this time period. Then they take the cane in, and they have to take it in regularly, because once you cut the cane, you only have about 15 or 20 minutes to get it into these stone rollers called crushers before the cane goes bad. Those rollers, those crushers actually cause the juice to come out. Then once the juice comes out, it falls into kind of a pan. They have to get that juice to these giant, like, I don't even know what you want to call them, like these giant vats that they boil it in to reduce the water off to create the cane sugar, right? And you only have about 10 or 15 minutes after you crush it and juice it to get it into the vats to boil. So you got to have a lot of people working all the time around the clock. But the other reason is high mortality rate. Think about this. You've got people circling around the cane field in the sun 14, 16 hours, swinging machetes. Accidents do happen regularly because of that. Or people working long hours next to the fires for, where the vats are, things like this. There are a lot of accidents that happen because of the harsh conditions, because there's no safety, because people are really put through a lot in these plantations. In fact, the average life expectancy of a sugar plantation slave in the time period, y'all, was less than 2 years. All right. So that caused huge turnover, and a lot that meant that huge amounts of enslaved labor was imported every year, and more of it, right? So that answers the question of how does the sugar industry cause a boom in the number of enslaved Africans involved. All right, again, I'll open up for questions. Anybody has any? Again, and these are very heavy topics, and rather unfortunately have become politically charged in the minds of some people. But we've talked about this. We talk about history as it is. So questions that you guys may have. All right, so the next time we get together, we'll talk about that last little chunk of that last slide. Then we're going to move right over into Busa's Rebellion and talk about it, work with the website. I'm excited to do that since we didn't get to do our previous website work. And we'll work with that. We'll come back and we'll discuss it. We'll talk about it, et cetera, et cetera. So that'll be, we'll do that in class. You don't have to do it out of class. That'll be next Tuesday that we'll take care of all of the rest of that. All right? Everybody good? All right. Sorry,
Yes.
also to leave you guys with it's a very heavy topic too. So I know probably right now your souls all feel just a little bit weighed down. So I apologize, but an important topic to talk about. So, all right. I will then see you guys next Tuesday. I wish you all a good weekend, and all right, we'll keep marching toward that midterm. You're like, oh, don't bring up the midterm. All right, I will see you all. All right, take care of yourselves.